The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Millbrook, Texas, as Sarah McKinnon stood before the assembled crowd, her chin raised despite the trembling in her hands. The year was 1867, and the town had gathered not for celebration, but for judgment. Sarah McKinnon. Judge Hawthorne's voice boomed across the wooden platform. You stand accused of conduct unbecoming a Christian woman, of defying the natural order, and of bringing shame upon this God-fearing community. The crowd murmured their agreement, bonnets nodding like wheat in the wind. Sarah's emerald eyes swept across the faces she had known since childhood. Mrs. Patterson from the general store, the Brewster family from the neighboring farm, even young Timothy Walsh who had once courted her with wildflowers and shy smiles. "Ain't done nothing but speak my mind," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the defiance that had landed her in this predicament. The Texas drawl in her voice was thick with emotion, but her words were clear and unwavering. Judge Hawthorne's weathered face creased into a scowl. "Speaking your mind, you call it? Arguing with Reverend Collins during Sunday service? Refusing 3 proper marriage proposals? Working alongside the men in the fields like some heathen?" The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke from the chimneys dotting the small frontier town. Sarah's auburn hair caught the light, a wild mane that she refused to tame with pins and ribbons like the other women. Her calico dress, though clean, showed the wear of hard work, patches on the elbows and a hem stained with Texas red dirt. "The Lord gave me a mind same as any man," she shot back, ignoring the gasps from the crowd. "And these hands can work, just as hard. I see no sin in using what he blessed me with." Old Mrs. Caldwell stepped forward, her cane tapping against the wooden boards. "She's been trouble since she was knee-high to a grasshopper, Judge. Always questioning, always pushing, against what's proper. Her poor departed mother, God rest her soul, tried to raise her right, but the devil's got hold of this one." Sarah's heart clenched at the mention of her mother, but she kept her expression steady. Mary McKinnon had died of fever 3 years prior, leaving Sarah alone with a father who'd drowned his grief in whiskey before joining his wife in the ground come winter. The judge raised his gavel, and the crowd fell silent except for the whisper of wind through the cottonwood trees. "Sarah McKinnon, this community has had enough of your willful ways. You are hereby declared unsuitable for marriage within the bounds of this town. Let it be known that any man who would take you as wife brings shame upon himself and his family." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo off the surrounding buildings. Sarah felt the words hit her like a physical blow, but she refused to let the tears burning behind her eyes fall in front of these people. "Furthermore," Judge Hawthorne continued, his voice growing cold, "you have 1 week to find alternative arrangements. This town will no longer shelter those who mock God's design for womanhood." As the crowd began to disperse, their whispers following Sarah like storm clouds, she caught sight of her few remaining possessions piled unceremoniously by the courthouse steps. Her mother's Bible, a worn quilt, and the small bundle of clothes that represented everything she owned in the world. Mrs. Patterson approached hesitantly, her round face creased with what might have been sympathy. "Sarah, dear, if you'd consider changing your ways, perhaps..." "Perhaps what?" Sarah's voice was sharp as broken glass. "Perhaps I should pretend to be something I ain't. Smile and curtsy and speak only when spoken to?" She shook her head, auburn curls dancing. "I'd rather face whatever's out there than live as half a person in here." The older woman flinched and hurried away, leaving Sarah alone on the courthouse steps as the town went about its business as if she'd already vanished from their sight. That evening, as purple shadows stretched across the prairie, Sarah sat on the edge of town beside her small campfire, the flames casting dancing light across her determined face. The Texas landscape stretched endlessly before her, rolling hills covered in sagebrush and wild grass broken by stands of mesquite and oak. In the distance, the Llano River caught the last rays of sunlight like a ribbon of molten silver. She opened her mother's Bible, the leather cover worn soft from years of handling, and read by firelight the passages her mother had marked. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The familiar words brought little comfort tonight. A coyote howled somewhere in the darkness, answered by another from across the valley. Sarah pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and added another piece of wood to the fire. Tomorrow she would head west, toward the frontier settlements where perhaps a woman with willing hands and a strong back might find a place, regardless of what some small-town judge thought of her character. As the stars emerged in the vast Texas sky, brighter and more numerous than any she'd ever seen from town, Sarah made herself a promise. She would survive this exile, and she would do it on her own terms. The same spirit that had gotten her branded as too wild to wed would carry her through whatever lay ahead. The wind shifted, bringing with it the scent of distant rain, and something else, something wild and untamed that seemed to call to the very core of who she was. Sarah smiled for the first time in days, her green eyes reflecting the firelight as she gazed westward into the unknown. 3 weeks of hard travel had transformed Sarah from a town outcast into something harder, leaner, and infinitely more determined. The autumn sun had bronzed her skin despite her wide-brimmed hat, and her hands, already calloused from farm work, now bore new scars from setting up camp each night and breaking it down each dawn. She'd traded her wagon and mule in the last settlement for supplies and a sturdy bay mare named Ginger, reasoning that speed might serve her better than cargo space in this vast, unforgiving land. The horse was a good companion, steady, sure-footed, and unbothered by Sarah's tendency to talk aloud to herself during the long, lonely hours on the trail. "Well, Ginger," Sarah murmured as they crested a low hill covered in scrub oak and prickly, "Persionder looks like we've found the edge of the world." Before them stretched a landscape that seemed to go on forever, endless rolling plains broken by rocky outcroppings and dry creek beds. The nearest settlement, according to her rough map, was Fort Griffin, still 2 days' ride to the northwest. But between here and there lay the Comanche, the vast territory that the Comanche nation had defended fiercely for generations. Sarah had heard the stories, of course. Every frontier town was full of them, tales of raids, captives, and warriors who could appear and vanish like smoke on the wind. Most settlers gave the region a wide berth, taking longer, safer routes to their destinations. But Sarah's supplies were running low, and winter was coming fast to the high plains of Texas. She made camp that evening in a grove of cottonwoods beside a spring-fed creek, grateful for the shelter of the trees and the sound of running water. As she tended to Ginger and built her small fire, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The sensation had grown stronger over the past 2 days, a prickling between her shoulder blades that made her constantly glance over her shoulder. "Just nerves," she told herself firmly, stirring the beans in her small pot. "Ain't nothing out there but rabbits and coyotes." But as full darkness fell and the fire burned down to coals, Sarah heard something that made her blood run cold. The distant sound of drums, rhythmic and hypnotic, carried on the night wind. She'd never heard Comanche drums before, but something in the deep, primal beat told her exactly what they were. She spent a sleepless night with her father's old rifle, across her knees starting at every sound. When dawn finally came, pale and gray with the promise of rain, she packed her gear with shaking hands and pushed Ginger hard toward the northwest, hoping to reach Fort Griffin before nightfall. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. They appeared, like ghosts from the morning mist, a dozen warriors on painted ponies, their faces marked with war paint, their weapons glinting in the weak autumn sun. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she pulled Ginger to a halt, knowing that running would only delay the inevitable. The warrior at the front of the group urged his horse forward, and Sarah got her first clear look at him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the lean, muscular build of a man who lived his life on horseback. His black hair was braided with feathers and strips of leather, and 3 parallel scars marked his left cheek, like ritual tattoos. But it was his eyes that held her, dark as midnight, intelligent and utterly fearless. He spoke in Comanche, his voice deep and commanding, and though Sarah couldn't understand the words, she heard the question in his tone. "I don't understand," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm just traveling through. I mean no harm to anyone." The warrior, clearly their leader, studied her for a long moment, his gaze taking in her worn dress, her sun-weathered face and the rifle she still held across her saddle. He spoke again, this time in heavily accented English. "You are far from your people, white woman. This is dangerous land for one alone." Sarah lifted her chin, calling on the same defiance that had gotten her exiled from Millbrook. "I can take care of myself." Something that might have been amusement flickered in the warrior's dark eyes. He said something in Comanche to his men, and several of them chuckled. Then he looked back at Sarah. "I am Chief Running Wolf of the Pennateca Band. You will come with us." It wasn't a request, and Sarah knew better than to argue with 12 armed warriors on hostile ground. She nodded slowly, her mind racing. She'd heard that some captives were treated well, even adopted into the tribe. Others, well, she tried not to think about the other stories. "What's your name?" Chief Running Wolf asked as they began to move, his warriors forming a loose circle around Sarah and her mare. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then decided that honesty was her best chance for survival. "Sarah McKinnon," the chief repeated, her name, the unfamiliar sound sitting strangely on his tongue. "Sarah, why do you travel alone? Where is your husband, your family?" The question hit closer to home than any arrow could have. Sarah's jaw tightened, and she felt the familiar burn of shame and anger in her chest. "Don't have any," she said shortly. "Town decided I wasn't fit for marriage or family life." Chief Running Wolf's eyebrows rose, and he said something in Comanche that made his warriors look at Sarah with new interest. Then he turned back to her, his expression thoughtful. "A woman who is too strong for her own people," he mused. "This is interesting." As they rode deeper into Comanche territory, Sarah found herself studying the chief when she thought he wasn't looking. There was something about him, a quiet confidence, a way of moving that spoke of absolute command over his environment, that was unlike any man she'd ever known. The men in Millbrook had always seemed diminished by her strength, threatened by her independence. But Chief Running Wolf appeared genuinely intrigued by it. The landscape around them grew more rugged as they traveled, with rocky mesas rising from the plains like ancient fortresses. The sky had grown heavy with clouds, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall as they approached what Sarah assumed was their destination. The Comanche camp was larger than she'd expected. Dozens of teepees arranged in a rough circle with horses grazing nearby and children playing between the dwellings. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and the smell of roasted meat made Sarah's stomach growl, reminding her that she'd been too nervous to eat that morning. As they rode into the camp, curious faces emerged from teepees and gathered around cooking fires. Sarah felt dozens of eyes on her, studying this strange white woman their warriors had brought home. Some faces showed curiosity, others suspicion, and a few displayed outright hostility. Chief Running Wolf raised his hand, and the murmur of voices fell silent. He spoke in Comanche, his voice carrying clearly across the camp, and Sarah caught her name in the flow of unfamiliar words. Whatever he was saying caused a stir among the assembled tribe members, with heated discussions breaking out in small groups. An elderly woman approached, her gray hair braided with silver ornaments and her weathered face marked with the kind of authority that came from years of wisdom. She spoke rapidly to the chief in Comanche, her tone clearly questioning, and Sarah caught the sharp edge of disapproval in her voice. Chief Running Wolf replied calmly, but firmly, his posture making it clear that his decision was final. The old woman's eyes flicked to Sarah, studying her with the intensity of a hawk evaluating its prey. Then she nodded slowly and stepped back. "Grandmother White Dove questions the wisdom of bringing a white woman to our camp," Chief Running Wolf explained to Sarah. "But she accepts that you are here under my protection." The rain was falling harder now, turning the dust to mud and sending people hurrying for the shelter of their teepees. Chief Running Wolf dismounted and gestured for Sarah to do the same. "You will stay in my teepee tonight," he said, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. At her expression, he added, "As my guest, you will not be harmed." As Sarah followed the chief toward the largest teepee in the camp, she couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring. She was alive, which was more than she'd dared hope when the warriors first appeared. But she was also completely at the mercy of people whose language she didn't speak, whose customs she didn't understand, and whose reasons for keeping her alive remained a mystery. The wind picked up, driving the rain horizontally across the camp and making the teepee walls flap like wings. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the plains like the drums she'd heard the night before, deep, primal, and full of power she couldn't begin to understand. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Comanche camp, with yesterday's storm having passed but leaving behind a crisp reminder that winter was not far away. Sarah had spent the night curled in buffalo robes on one side of Chief Running Wolf's teepee, while he slept on the other, separated by the dying embers of a small fire. Despite her fears, he had kept his word. She remained untouched and unharmed. She woke to the sound of voices outside the teepee, speaking in rapid Comanche. The tone was urgent, and she caught the chief's name mentioned several times. Sarah sat up, pulling the warm robe around her shoulders, and tried to make sense of what was happening. Chief Running Wolf stirred, coming instantly awake with the alertness of a man accustomed to danger. He listened to the voices for a moment, then rose and stepped outside. Sarah could hear him speaking with someone, a man's voice younger than his own, agitated and insistent. When the chief returned, his expression was troubled. He crouched by the fire and began building it up again, the flames casting dancing shadows across his weathered features. "There is news from the east," he said without looking at Sarah. 3 families of our people were killed by white soldiers, near the Brazos River. Women, children, elders, all dead. Sarah felt her stomach drop. She'd heard stories of such raids, but they'd always seemed distant, unreal. Now sitting in a Comanche teepee with the scent of smoke and buffalo hide around her, the reality hit her like a physical blow. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. That's terrible." Chief Running Wolf's dark eyes found hers, and she saw anger there, but also something else. A deep, weary sadness that spoke of too many such mornings, too many such losses. "My warriors call for revenge," he continued. "They say we should ride to the nearest white settlement and show them how it feels to lose families." The implication hung heavy in the air. Sarah understood now why the voices outside had been so urgent, so angry. She represented everything the warriors wanted to strike back against. "But you're the chief," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "You make the decisions." A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. "You think leadership means doing whatever I wish? A chief who ignores his warriors' anger will not remain chief for long." Sarah studied his face, seeing the weight of responsibility there, the burden of making choices that could mean life or death for his people. It was a kind of loneliness she recognized, the isolation that came with being different, with seeing the world through eyes that others couldn't understand. "What will you do?" she asked. Before he could answer, the teepee flap was pulled aside and 3 warriors entered. Sarah recognized one of them from yesterday's capture party, a young man with fierce eyes and fresh war paint streaking his cheeks. He spoke rapidly to Chief Running Wolf, gesturing toward Sarah, his voice growing more heated with each word. The chief listened patiently, then responded in a calm, measured tone that only seemed to inflame the young warrior further. The man's voice rose, and though Sarah couldn't understand the words, she had no trouble reading the hostility in his posture, the way his hand kept moving to the knife at his belt. Finally, Chief Running Wolf stood, his full height and commanding presence filling the teepee. He spoke one word, sharp, final, unmistakably a command. The young warrior's jaw tightened, but he stepped back. The chief continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, and Sarah caught her name again. In the flow of Comanche words, when the warriors left, their expressions ranging from confusion to barely contained fury, Chief Running Wolf turned back to Sarah. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant sounds of the camp coming to life. "What did?" "You tell them?" Sarah asked. The chief was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, deliberate. "I told them that you are no longer their prisoner, that you are my wife." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Of all the things she'd expected him to say, that wasn't one of them. She stared at him, searching his face for some sign that she'd misunderstood. Your wife? It is the only way to protect you, he said simply. A captive can be killed to avenge our dead. A wife of the chief cannot. Sarah's mind reeled. She thought of Judge Hawthorne's words, of the crowd in Millbrook declaring her too wild to wed, of the shame and exile that had driven her to this place. Now at the edge of the world, surrounded by people who should have been her enemies, a man was offering her the very thing her own people had decided she could never have. But we don't know each other, she protested. We can't just... Can't we? Chief Running Wolf interrupted, and there was something almost gentle in his voice. You told me your own people cast you out for being too strong, too independent. Here, strength in a woman is valued. You ride well, you do not cry or beg, and you speak your mind even when surrounded by armed warriors. These are qualities my people respect. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. Why? Why would you do this for me? I'm nothing to you, just some white woman who got lost. The chief crouched down beside her, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, smelled the sage smoke that clung to his clothes. When I was young, he said quietly, my grandmother told me that sometimes the spirits send us exactly what we need, but in a form we don't expect. My first wife died of the spotted sickness 3 winters ago. My people have been urging me to take another wife, to have sons to lead the band after I am gone. But I have not found a woman who... He paused, searching for words in English to express thoughts that belonged to another language, another way of seeing the world. Who what? Sarah prompted. Who burns with the same fire I do. Who sees the world as a place to be explored, not endured. Who would rather face the unknown than live safely in a cage. His words hit her like an arrow finding its mark. Sarah thought. Of all the men in Millbrook who had courted her, who had seen her spirit as something to be broken rather than celebrated, who had wanted to marry the woman they thought she could become rather than the woman she was. And you think I'm that woman? She asked. I think, Chief Running Wolf said, that you traveled alone through Comanche territory rather than live as something you're not. I think you face a camp full of warriors with your chin up and your eyes clear. I think the spirits have a sense of humor, sending me a wife from the very people who declared her unfit for marriage. Despite everything, the strangeness of the situation, the danger she was still in, the impossibility of it all. Sarah found herself laughing. It started as a chuckle, then grew until she was shaking with mirth, tears streaming down her cheeks. They called me too wild to wed, she gasped, between laughs. If they could see me now. Chief Running Wolf smiled, the expression transforming his stern features into something warm and unexpectedly handsome. Then we are agreed? You will be my wife? Sarah wiped her eyes and looked at him, really looked at him. She saw a man who led with both strength and wisdom, who protected what he valued, who offered her not just safety but acceptance. She thought of the long, lonely years stretching ahead if she refused, of trying to build a life in some distant settlement where she would always be the strange woman with no family, no past worth mentioning. Here, incredibly, she could be herself, wild, independent, unbroken, and valued for it rather than shamed. Yes, she said, the word coming out stronger and more certain than she'd expected. Yes, I'll be your wife. The ceremony, such as it was, took place that afternoon. The entire band gathered in a circle, their faces showing everything from curiosity to skepticism to outright disapproval. Grandmother White Dove had painted symbols on Sarah's face with red clay, muttering what sounded like prayers or possibly curses in Comanche. Chief Running Wolf spoke to his people, his voice carrying clearly across the camp. Sarah caught her name again, and words that she was beginning to recognize. His name for her in Comanche, something that sounded like fierce heart woman. Then he took her hand, his calloused fingers warm and steady around hers, and spoke directly to her in English. I take you as my wife, Sarah McKinnon. I will protect you, provide for you, and honor your strength as long as I draw breath. Sarah looked into his eyes, dark and serious, and full of a promise she was only beginning to understand. Around them, the Comanche band watched in silence, and she realized that whatever happened next, there would be no going back to the woman she had been. I take you as my husband, she replied, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. I will stand with you, fight beside you if needed, and honor the home you've offered me. As the sun set over the vast Texas plains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Sarah McKinnon became the wife of a Comanche chief. The woman who had been declared too wild to wed had found her place at last, not by becoming tame, but by finding someone brave enough to run wild beside her. But even as, she felt a strange peace settling over her heart. She knew that the real test lay ahead. The world beyond this camp was still divided by fear and hatred, and their union had created something unprecedented, something that could either bridge two worlds or destroy them both. Winter had settled over the Comanche camp like a thick buffalo robe, bringing with it a deceptive peace that Sarah had learned not to trust. 3 months had passed since her marriage to Chief Running Wolf, and she'd begun to feel truly at home among the Penteteca band. She'd learned enough Comanche to hold basic conversations, had proven herself useful in treating injuries and illnesses, with remedies her mother had taught her, and had even earned grudging respect from some of the women who'd initially viewed her with suspicion. But peace, Sarah was learning, was a fragile thing on the frontier. The trouble began on a morning when the air was so cold it burned her lungs and the ground was hard as iron beneath her feet. Sarah was helping grandmother White Dove prepare medicine for a sick child, when young Swift Arrow came racing into camp on a lathered horse, his face grim beneath his war paint. He spoke rapidly to the group of warriors who gathered around him, his words urgent and breathless. Sarah caught enough to understand that he'd seen something. White men, soldiers, moving toward their winter camp. Chief Running Wolf emerged from their teepee, his expression darkening as he listened to the scout's report. How many? He asked in English, for Sarah's benefit. 24, maybe more, Swift Arrow replied, also switching to English, though his accent was thick. They move slow, bring wagons, but they come this way, no mistake. Sarah felt ice form in her stomach that had nothing to do with the winter air. She'd hoped that the isolation of their winter camp would keep them safe from the growing tensions between the army and the various Comanche bands, but it seemed that hope had been foolish. Chief Running Wolf was already giving orders, his voice calm but commanding. Warriors began preparing weapons, women started gathering essential belongings, and the organized chaos of a camp preparing to move filled the air. Sarah, her husband said, turning to her with an expression she'd learned to read over their months together. It was the look he got when he was about to ask something difficult of her. I need you to do something. She nodded, waiting. These soldiers, they may be the same ones who killed our people near the Brazos. If they are, they will show no mercy to anyone in this camp. He paused, his dark eyes searching her face. But they might show mercy to you. You are white. You could tell them you were a captive. No. The word came out sharper than Sarah intended, cutting through his suggestion like a blade. Absolutely not. Sarah, be reasonable. If you go to them, explain who you are. I know exactly who I am, Sarah interrupted, her green eyes flashing. I'm your wife. I'm Fierce Heart Woman of the Penteteca band. I'm not running to hide behind the same people who would have let me die alone on the prairie. Chief Running Wolf's jaw tightened. This is not about pride. This is about survival. If something happens to me, to our warriors, you could be the bridge between our peoples. You could prevent more bloodshed. Sarah stared at him, understanding dawning slowly. He wasn't just trying to protect her. He was positioning her to protect his people if the worst happened. The realization hit her like a physical blow, equal parts terrifying and humbling. You think you're going to die, she said quietly. I think, he replied carefully, that I am prepared to die to protect my people. But I would prefer that my wife live to carry our story forward. Before Sarah could respond, a commotion at the edge of camp drew their attention. A rider was approaching under a white flag. A soldier, young and nervous-looking, his blue uniform stark against the winter landscape. Chief Running Wolf stepped forward to meet him, and Sarah followed despite her husband's gesture for her to stay back. The soldier's eyes widened when he saw her, taking in her white skin and the Comanche dress and jewelry she wore, the paint still adorning her face from the morning ceremony. "Ma'am," the soldier said, his voice cracking slightly. Are you a prisoner here?" Sarah felt every eye in the camp on her, felt the weight of two worlds pressing down on her shoulders. This was the moment Chief Running Wolf had been preparing for, the test of where her loyalty truly lay. "No, soldier," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the silent camp. "I'm not a prisoner. I'm the chief's wife." The young man's face went pale. "Ma'am, I don't understand." "You're white, you must be." "I'm exactly where I choose to be," Sarah interrupted. "Now, what does your commanding officer want?" The soldier straightened, clearly struggling to process what he was seeing. "Colonel Hayes sent me to negotiate. We know there are hostiles in this area, and we're prepared to offer safe passage to any white captives in exchange for peaceful relocation to the reservation." Sarah looked at Chief Running Wolf, seeing the grim understanding in his eyes. This wasn't really a negotiation. It was a barely veiled ultimatum. Submit to the reservation or be driven out by force. "Tell your colonel," Chief Running Wolf said, his English clear and precise, "that we are peaceful people in our winter camp. We have taken no hostile action against his soldiers or any white settlers." "But, sir," the soldier replied, his voice shaking slightly, "there have been raids, attacks, on homesteads."
"Indians have been killing innocent families, and innocent Indians have been killed by white families," Chief Running Wolf countered. "Does that make all white people guilty?" Sarah watched the exchange, feeling the terrible weight of history
pressing down on this small moment. She thought of the dead families Swift Arrow had reported, of the generations of violence and misunderstanding that had led to this confrontation. "What exactly is Colonel Hayes offering?" she asked. The soldier turned to her gratefully, apparently seeing her as a potential ally. "Safe transport to the reservation, ma'am. Government protection, supplies for the winter, and a cage," Chief Running Wolf said quietly. "He offers us a cage." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the impossible choice before them. She thought of the town of Millbrook, of the comfortable prison of conformity she'd rejected. She thought of the freedom she'd found here, the acceptance, the love that had grown between her and her husband over the long winter months. When she opened her eyes, her decision was clear. "Tell Colonel Hayes," she said to the soldier, "that the Penteca Band appreciates his offer, but we must respectfully decline. We are not hostile, but neither are we ready to give up our way of life." The soldier's face went from pale to flushed. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand the situation. The colonel has orders to clear this area of hostiles by any means necessary. If you don't come with me now, I can't guarantee your safety." Sarah felt Chief Running Wolf tense beside her, felt the ripple of anger that went through the assembled warriors. This was how wars started, with ultimatums disguised as negotiations. "I understand perfectly," Sarah said, stepping forward so she stood beside her husband rather than behind him. "You can tell your colonel that there are no hostiles in this camp, only people trying to live their lives in peace. If he chooses to make war on peaceful people, that choice is his to carry." The soldier stared at her for a long moment, then at Chief Running Wolf, then at the assembled warriors with their weapons ready but not raised. Finally, he nodded stiffly. "I'll deliver your message, ma'am. But please, reconsider. Things are changing out here. The old ways won't last much longer." As the soldier rode away, Sarah felt Chief Running Wolf's hand close over hers. Around them, the camp remained frozen in tense silence, waiting for their leader's next move. "You could have gone with him," he said quietly. "I could have," Sarah agreed. "But then I wouldn't be who you married, would I?" Chief Running Wolf smiled, the expression fierce and proud. "No, you would not." But as they watched the soldier disappear over the horizon, Sarah knew that their troubles were far from over. She had chosen her side, made her stand, but the weight of that choice would test them both in ways they couldn't yet imagine. That evening, as they sat by their fire and made plans for what might come, Sarah realized that her journey from exile to belonging had brought her to this moment, not as a victim of circumstances, but as a woman who had found her true home and was prepared to fight for it. The woman who had been too wild to wed had become exactly wild enough to stand between two worlds and hold the line for love, for family, for the right to choose one's own path no matter what the cost. Outside their tipi, the wind howled across the prairie, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise that their greatest test was yet to come. But inside, by the warmth of their fire, Sarah McKinnon, now fierce heart woman, felt the quiet strength that comes from finally knowing who you are and where you belong. The story would continue, she knew, beyond this night, beyond this winter, into a future that remained unwritten. But whatever came next, she would face it as herself, wild and free and exactly where she was meant to be.